In the forgotten woods of northern Maine, where pine trees stretch endlessly into the fog, and the wind whispers secrets no one dares to hear, there once stood a stone building known only to a few as the Convent of Eternal Tears. To the unknowing, it was a sanctuary, a holy refuge run by 3 pious women who claimed to be Anglican nuns seeking spiritual renewal in the wilds of the American frontier. But for those who truly understood what happened inside those thick stone walls, it was something else entirely. Over 600 women entered that place over 3 decades. Less than half ever walked out, and those who did were no longer the same. In the fall of 1798, the town of Millbridge was nothing more than a scattering of cabins near the Atlantic coast. A place where lumbermen, fishermen, and weary settlers braved brutal winters and superstition-laced nights. It was there, on a gray October morning, that the Ashford Sisters arrived. 3 women cloaked in black, their wagon heavy with medical crates and the scent of lavender masking something far more unsettling. The eldest, Agatha Ashford, called herself Mother Superior. She was in her early 40s, tall and commanding, with silver-streaked auburn hair and eyes the color of storm clouds. Her voice carried the accent of English nobility, every word precise, deliberate, impossible to ignore. She moved with the certainty of someone used to absolute control and never once looked back. Beside her stood Sister Prudence Ashford, gaunt and pale, hands always gloved, fingers long and strangely steady. She rarely spoke, and when she did, her voice held the faint trace of a Scottish burr that felt more like frostbite than warmth. Her eyes were ice, scanning every person she met as if measuring their weaknesses. Then there was the youngest, Temperance Ashford, barely into her 20s, with raven-black hair and eyes so dark they seemed bottomless. Townsfolk whispered she was beautiful, but it wasn't the kind of beauty that invited admiration. It was the kind that made people uneasy. Children cried in her presence without knowing why, and even the bravest men avoided her gaze. The sisters claimed to be fleeing persecution in England, hoping to establish a new spiritual order in the American wilderness. Their papers, impressive letters from supposed English clergy, were later revealed to be forgeries, but at the time they were convincing enough to satisfy the Protestant settlers of Millbridge. And the gold the sisters carried didn't hurt either. They paid triple the asking price for nearly 200 acres of remote woodland and hired every available hand to build what they called a house of worship. But what rose from that forest wasn't a church. It was a fortress. Thick stone walls, quarried from the nearby cliffs, stood 3 stories high. The windows were small and set unnaturally high on the walls, impossible to see into, even from horseback. The basement was deep, reinforced, and required weeks of excavation. Locals assumed it was for wine or winter stores, but the Ashford Sisters insisted it was for solitude. Solitude, they said, was essential for spiritual healing, the kind of healing that required total separation from the outside world. And people believed them. Why wouldn't they? The sisters were charming, generous, quiet. They attended local services, donated to the poor, and spoke with kindness and poise. They were, by all appearances, holy women with noble intentions. But beneath the polished surface, something darker simmered. They demanded heavy locks on every door, drainage systems built to handle large quantities of liquid, ventilation shafts that looked less like architectural necessity and more like preparation. For what? No one asked. Because nobody wanted to know. And those who wondered, who paused just long enough to feel the cold fingers of doubt crawl up their spine, quickly buried their concerns beneath the warm weight of coin and confidence. After all, what could possibly be wrong about a convent run by 3 refined women preaching Christian charity? But soon, women from miles away began arriving, sent by husbands, fathers, pastors, men desperate to correct behavior deemed troublesome. Some were too independent, others too emotional, some simply refused to marry. Whatever the flaw, the sisters had a cure, and for the right price, they promised something every man wanted: a woman reborn. But what they delivered was something else, something hollow, obedient, silent, and the screams. At first, they were dismissed as prayer, spiritual purging, the sisters called it, but the woods would not lie forever, not when they echoed with the sound of something human, breaking. The first real crack in the convent's flawless facade came on a brutal February night in 1803. Thomas Brewster, a 20-year-old trapper known for his skill in the woods, was tracking a wounded buck through the snow-covered forest. He had grown up in Millbridge, knew every tree, every trail. The woods were like a second home to him, but that night something felt wrong. The air was too still, the silence too deep. And then, from the direction of the convent, he heard it. At first, he thought it was a wild animal, maybe a wolf caught in a snare. But as he crept closer, it became clear that what he was hearing wasn't animal at all. It was human, screaming, high-pitched and ragged, so raw it felt like it was being torn straight from the soul. It came in waves, rising and falling, sometimes breaking into sobs, then climbing again into frenzied, blood-curdling shrieks. It didn't sound like prayer. It didn't sound like anything holy. Heart-pounding, Thomas moved toward the back of the convent, staying low in the snow. From the rear, he saw a faint light flickering behind one of the basement windows, partially buried under snowdrifts, almost hidden. The closer he got, the worse it became. He could hear voices now. Low, urgent. He could hear the clatter of metal against stone, and underneath it all, a steady, rhythmic sound that chilled his blood more than the freezing wind ever could. It sounded like sawing. He wiped the frost from the corner of the basement window and peered inside. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. The basement wasn't storage. It was a surgical theater. Dozens of oil lamps and candles illuminated the chamber, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. A woman was strapped to a wooden table, her arms and legs bound with thick leather restraints. Her head was held in place by a grotesque metal brace. And above her, cold and focused, stood Sister Prudence. Her expression was serene, methodical, her pale hands stained crimson as she guided a long, thin rod into a shaved portion of the woman's scalp. Lines had been drawn in black ink across the skin, guides like markings on a map, and beneath the skin, exposed bone gleamed wetly under the light. Thomas realized with sickening clarity her skull had been opened. The woman on the table thrashed weakly, her eyes wide with unimaginable terror. But her cries were no longer coherent, only raw sound, guttural, animal, almost beyond human. Standing beside Prudence was Temperance, handing her instruments with calm precision. Behind them, Mother Superior Agatha observed, scribbling notes into a thick ledger, as if documenting nothing more than a routine harvest. It was not the chaos of madness that Thomas witnessed. It was precision, routine, procedure. This had been done before. Thomas didn't remember how he got home. He only remembered the snow, the branches tearing at his clothes, and the certainty that if he didn't run, he would never leave that place alive. By dawn, he was in his father's blacksmith shop, raving, shaking, choking on his own words as he tried to describe the horrors he had seen. His father, a practical man, tried to calm him. "Son, you were alone, in a blizzard, tracking a wounded animal for hours. Your mind, it plays tricks in those conditions." But Thomas's eyes said otherwise. He described the room, the woman, the instruments. He remembered everything, the way Prudence held the scalpel, the sound of bone being cut. It was too detailed to be madness. Reluctantly, his father brought the matter to Deacon Morrison, the town's quiet, calculating moral anchor, a man who had kept the community together through war, famine, and fear. The deacon listened carefully, nodded slowly, then said the words Thomas dreaded most. "These are women of God," he whispered. "We must tread carefully. But deep in his heart, Deacon Morrison knew something was terribly, terribly wrong. Despite Deacon Morrison's instinct to protect the town's fragile harmony, he understood the gravity of what had been described. He had known Thomas since boyhood, knew him to be steady, not prone to fantasy. And while the idea of nuns conducting surgical rituals in the dead of night seemed preposterous, the look in Thomas's eyes spoke of something far too real. Still, the deacon chose discretion. Rather than raise an alarm, he arranged a quiet visit to the convent under the guise of soliciting support for a church fundraiser. It was a carefully crafted excuse, benign, unthreatening, the kind that wouldn't stir suspicion. Mother Superior Agatha welcomed him with her usual poise. She led him to a parlor as austere as it was spotless. Heavy wooden furniture, a crucifix looming over the hearth, religious paintings whose eyes seemed to follow his every move. She served tea, asked about his health, and expressed regret at not being more involved in the local parish. Her tone was warm. Her eyes were not. When the deacon, ever so gently, mentioned that local hunters had reported hearing troubling sounds near the convent, Agatha's face softened into a look of practiced concern. "We offer intense prayer sessions for those most afflicted," she explained smoothly. "Their cries are not of pain, but of demons being cast out through divine discipline." She described these sessions as spiritual exorcisms, rituals of penance, vocal and prolonged for women who had lost their way. Her theological explanation was thorough, even eloquent. The concept of spiritual warfare was not foreign to a man like Deacon Morrison. He nodded, not because he believed her, but because she gave him no obvious reason not to. Then, as if anticipating his next question, Agatha offered to give him a tour of the upper floors. The dormitories were modest but immaculate. Several women sat in silence, heads bowed in prayer. They wore the same gray robes, moved with the same quiet precision. But something about them was wrong. They didn't blink, they didn't fidget, they didn't smile. They looked like people who had forgotten how to be people. When the deacon tried to engage one in conversation, she barely reacted. Her eyes drifted past him, glassy and unfocused, as if she were watching something he couldn't see. Another woman moved past him like a ghost, her steps too smooth, her hands too still. None of them spoke unless directly addressed. And even then, their answers were clipped, vacant, rehearsed. When he asked, cautiously, if he might see the lower levels, Agatha declined with gentle firmness. "That area is reserved for our most delicate cases," she said. "Women undergoing advanced spiritual counseling require privacy to maintain dignity and focus." It made sense, on the surface. Still, something gnawed at him, something he couldn't quite articulate. As he rode home through the woods that evening, Deacon Morrison tried to convince himself that Thomas had been mistaken, that the sisters were simply rigorous in their faith, that the silence and strangeness he'd observed were byproducts of religious discipline, not something darker. But the image of those women haunted him, their dead eyes, their mechanical grace. And there was something else, a smell that clung to the hallways. Not overpowering, but persistent, medicinal, metallic. It reminded him of the field hospitals from the war, places filled with blood, sorrow, and pain. Shortly after his visit, the convent implemented new rules. Visitors were no longer permitted without written approval. Deliveries were to be left at the gates, and the nightly sounds, those distant, echoing cries, ceased altogether. In their place came something far more sinister. Silence. So absolute, it pressed against the night like a threat. And still, women kept arriving, shipped in from distant towns, delivered by families eager to erase shame, sin, or defiance. The Ashford Sisters welcomed them with open arms, and behind locked doors, they went to work. As the silence around the convent deepened, the transformations within it became harder to ignore. At first, the women who returned from the Convent of Eternal Tears were praised. Their families wept with joy. "She's finally changed," they said. "She's obedient now. She's calm." But it didn't take long for that joy to curdle into confusion, and then into fear. Mary Prescott had been the first local girl to come back. 19 years old, proud, sharp-witted, and famously unwilling to marry any of the suitors her family paraded before her. She had always been a force of nature, laughing too loud, thinking too deeply, reading books her father said were for men. Her parents sent her to the convent after she refused a third proposal from a wealthy merchant's son. They'd said it was for her own good, to straighten her out, to teach her how to be a proper woman. 6 months later, she returned. But it wasn't Mary. She looked the same, more or less. A little thinner, paler, her hair shorter than before. But it was her eyes that told the real story. They no longer sparkled with curiosity or mischief. They were blank, empty, like windows with the curtains drawn. She didn't speak unless spoken to, didn't argue, didn't question. When her father suggested a new marriage prospect, she nodded once and said, "As you wish, sir." When asked about her time at the convent, she replied with the same phrase every time: "I prayed to become better." Mary moved through life like a ghost, drifting from room to room, forgetting things she'd once loved. She didn't laugh, didn't cry. She didn't even remember the names of her childhood friends. When her mother brushed her hair, she noticed something strange. Scars. Thin, curved lines across her scalp, hidden beneath strands of growing hair. Scars that didn't belong to any known injury. When pressed about them, Mary tilted her head, confused. "I don't remember," she said. More women followed. Hannah Morse, once devastated by the loss of her infant son, returned from the convent unnaturally cheerful. Her grief was gone, but so were her memories. She claimed she never had a child, couldn't even recognize his toys. Elizabeth Thornton, a merchant's wife, had been sent away after accusing her husband of infidelity. She came back insisting the accusations had never been made. Her mind rewrote history with perfect obedience. Each case was eerily similar. The same mechanical speech, the same emotionless expressions, the same scars, and yet, every time, the sisters claimed success. Dr. Samuel Hartwell continued to defend their methods. Publicly, he called the results miraculous. In private, however, he was unraveling. Once respected, now often drunk, he ranted to himself in his study, filling pages of his journal with contradictions. He praised the sisters' brilliance, but questioned his own soul. The procedures, he wrote, defied everything he'd been taught about medicine. They weren't healing minds, they were erasing them. Still, he kept supplying them with equipment and referrals. The rewards were too great, and the risk, it seemed small until the patterns became undeniable. Martha Goodwin, whose daughter Rebecca had returned changed, began speaking to other families. Quietly, cautiously. And what she discovered shook her to the core. None of the women who had undergone intensive treatment remembered anything about their time in the convent. Only fragments, prayers, cold rooms, a woman's voice whispering instructions, a burning smell. Nothing else. No meals, no conversations, no laughter, just blackness, and some never came back at all. The sisters claimed these women had chosen a life of service, nuns in training, devoted to silence and solitude. But when mothers begged to visit their daughters, they were told no. When husbands demanded answers, they were offered only polite refusals and vague promises. No one pushed harder. Not yet. But the whispers had begun. And once whispers find air, they grow into storms. As Martha Goodwin's quiet inquiries spread through the town, they awakened something long buried in the hearts of Millbridge's people. Doubt. At first, it was shared only in whispers, between mothers in kitchens, between brothers on long wagon rides. But the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Too many women had come back wrong. Too many hadn't come back at all. And the explanations from the Ashford Sisters, once seen as charitable and saintly, began to feel rehearsed, too perfect, too polished. Then came the revelation that shattered what little confidence remained. Martha had begun keeping a list. She'd spoken with over a dozen families. Many of their daughters and wives had been sent to the convent for spiritual correction, and many had returned, altered, but several had never returned. And each time a family asked to visit one of these so-called permanent residents, the response was the same: vows of silence, devotion to prayer, seclusion for their spiritual purity. No visitors, no letters, no goodbyes. It wasn't just locals anymore. Women were arriving from across the Northeast, Boston, Providence, even as far as Philadelphia. Families were paying steep fees, willingly sending their daughters to this remote convent in the Maine woods, drawn by rumors of miraculous results. The more distant the family, the easier it was to cut off contact. And the higher the payment, the fewer questions were asked. The price for what the sisters now called comprehensive reformation had risen to $500, a staggering sum for the time. But to the wealthy elite, it was nothing. And to some, the promise of obedience and silence from a scandalous daughter was worth any cost. Martha's concern turned to alarm when she tried to find records, birth records, marriage licenses, obituaries. For several of the missing women, there were none. It was as if they'd been erased. She went to Sheriff William Hawthorne. A veteran of the Revolution, he was known as a man of facts, not feelings. He listened, eyes narrowed, lips pressed thin, while Martha laid out everything: dates, names, the growing list of missing women, the scars no one could explain. The sheriff didn't promise much, just a nod. A quiet, "I'll look into it." But that was more than anyone had done in years. He started with Dr. Hartwell. The physician looked worn, older than his 50-something years. His desk was littered with journals and empty brandy bottles. When asked about the convent, his eyes twitched, his fingers drummed the table. "They're pioneers," he said flatly. "They're curing ailments most doctors won't even acknowledge." When Sheriff Hawthorne asked about the scars on the women's heads, Hartwell became defensive. "Advanced procedures," he muttered. "Neurological alignment, necessary interventions." "Interventions," the sheriff repeated. Hartwell nodded. "You don't understand, Sheriff. What they've discovered, what they can do, it's decades ahead of Europe. Behavioral correction through surgical science, memories, habits, they're removable." The words chilled the room. And still, Hartwell defended them. The women they treat, many were unfit for society, rebels, liabilities. They were lost. The sisters gave them purpose. "But at what cost?" the sheriff asked. Hartwell didn't answer. He just stared at the floor, lost in some private storm. Later that night, Hawthorne returned to the station and read through old town reports. He found the original testimony from Thomas Brewster, filed away and nearly forgotten. Then he found Morrison's quiet visit, his report filed with vague reassurances and careful avoidance. There it was, buried in bureaucratic language. The truth had always been there. They just hadn't wanted to see it. Now, with mounting evidence and a list of names growing by the week, the sheriff realized the time for quiet investigations had passed. Something was happening behind those walls. Something far more than spiritual correction. Something calculated, surgical, industrial. And if it wasn't stopped soon, more would vanish. More would be erased. Sheriff Hawthorne knew that if he were to move against the Ashford Sisters, he couldn't do it alone. Not with the power they held, not with the secrets they guarded. He needed help. Men he could trust. He gathered a small circle, all veterans, all men who owed him favors or shared his suspicions. Farmers, tradesmen, hunters, hard men, quiet men. Men who didn't flinch when he told them they might see something unnatural. Together, they planned a quiet inspection. No warrants, no warnings, just a visit. But the sisters were one step ahead. When the sheriff's group arrived at the convent gates, they were greeted with calm smiles. The same cold grace. Mother Superior. Agatha met them herself. She expressed surprise but no alarm. "Of course, Sheriff. You're welcome to inspect the premises. We have nothing to hide." She led them through the chapel, the kitchens, the upper dormitories. Everything was spotless, silent, perfect. The women they passed lowered their heads in prayer or stared blankly out of windows. No one spoke, no one smiled, no one blinked. The sheriff requested access to the lower levels. Agatha hesitated only for a second. "I'm afraid that area is currently under quarantine," she said, her tone gentle. "We've had a small outbreak of illness. Nothing serious, but we must ensure the safety of all residents." The sheriff pressed. Agatha stood firm. "I must ask you to respect our protocols, Sheriff," she said softly. "These women are in fragile states. Disruption could harm their progress." It was a polite refusal, but a refusal nonetheless. As they left the building, one of the deputies, an old scout named Eli Tannen, leaned in and whispered, "They've hidden it. Whatever it is, they moved it." And Hawthorne knew he was right. That night, the sheriff returned to his office and wrote a full report to state authorities in Portland. He included everything: Martha's list, the doctor's words, the scars, the locked doors. He asked for federal support, but letters take time, and the sisters were not waiting. The very next morning, a courier arrived at the sheriff's office. A boy, no older than 12. He carried a sealed envelope, addressed in flowing script. Inside was a letter from Mother Superior Agatha. It thanked him for his visit, expressed deep gratitude for his continued concern for the community, assured him that the convent remained a place of healing and holiness. And then, at the bottom, a single sentence written in a different hand. Smaller. Tighter. "You're closer to danger than you know. Stop." The message was clear. The sheriff was being warned, maybe even threatened. But not in anger, not with rage, with certainty. The following week, word came from a trapper who lived along the outer woods. He'd found something near the convent's property, something he didn't understand. A pit, shallow, freshly dug, covered in pine branches and loose earth. Inside it, bones, human, small, female. The sheriff didn't hesitate. He returned to the convent with 3 deputies and a map. This time he wasn't asking. He was searching, but when they arrived, the gates stood open. The horses were gone. The windows were dark. The sisters had vanished. Inside, the building had been stripped. Papers burned, beds turned, instruments removed. What remained was little more than stone and silence. Until they reached the basement. Behind a false wall, they found what the sisters had failed to erase. Preserved bodies, surgical tables, notes etched in Latin and English, diagrams of skulls, sections of brain preserved in cloudy jars. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. The sheriff now faced a nightmare far beyond local jurisdiction. The truth would reach higher than he'd ever imagined. The Ashford Sisters hadn't just disappeared. They had escaped, and what they'd left behind wasn't madness. It was method. The federal marshals arrived 2 weeks too late. By the time they reached Millbridge, the convent was already a hollow shell. Sheriff Hawthorne showed them everything. The false walls, the hidden chambers, the bodies suspended in glass jars. The marshals walked through the stone corridors in stunned silence, stopping only to photograph what little remained. They found surgical notes written in crisp, clinical language. Each page catalogued a patient: name, age, symptoms, treatment, post-procedure observations, and most chilling of all, a column labeled disposition. Some were marked returned. Others, many others, simply said expired. The sisters hadn't just vanished. They had planned their escape, meticulously. Bank records revealed quiet withdrawals over the past year. Small amounts moved from accounts across multiple towns. They'd been laundering their money, hiding their wealth under false names. One account traced back to Boston held over $50,000, enough to buy silence, passage, and protection almost anywhere in the world. And the paper trail didn't end there. The marshals discovered correspondence, letters exchanged between the convent and addresses in Europe. Most were coded, some written in French, others in German and Latin. But their contents were unmistakable. Reports, research findings, financial negotiations. The Ashford Sisters had been selling their experiments. Universities in Vienna, Edinburgh, and Paris had been purchasing their data. Detailed reports on behavioral modification, diagrams of surgical techniques, case studies of memory suppression and emotional blunting. Institutions had unknowingly built part of their medical foundations on the backs of the women mutilated in Maine. The marshals traced several shipments, crates labeled as anatomical specimens, clinical glassware, donation samples. They had passed through ports up and down the eastern seaboard, bound for foreign labs and private collectors. The horror wasn't just local, it was global. The deeper they dug, the more monstrous the scale became. The sisters had processed over 600 women in 21 years. Of those, nearly 200 were listed as expired. 100 more had never been accounted for. The rest were returned to their families, but not as the women they had once been. And even worse, evidence pointed to a new phase of their operation. In the last year, the convent had begun accepting volunteers. Destitute women from coastal cities, widows, prostitutes, vagrants. They'd been promised food and shelter in exchange for participation in experimental treatment programs. But they weren't patients. They were subjects, test cases for procedures too risky to perform on clients from wealthy families. The sisters had turned their sanctuary into a factory, a facility for reshaping human minds. Not with kindness, not with therapy, but with steel and sedation. The authorities were horrified, but also fascinated. Behind closed doors, some of the officials debated whether any of the research could be salvaged. The knowledge, the surgical precision, the conditioning techniques, the behavioral results was decades ahead of its time. Too advanced to ignore, too unethical to embrace. Sheriff Hawthorne watched those conversations with growing disgust. He knew what they were really asking. How far are we willing to go if it means controlling the human mind? The investigation lasted months. The convent was sealed, the documents archived. Most were buried under layers of red tape. Some, conveniently, disappeared. And the Ashford Sisters? Gone. But rumors began to spread. 3 women, foreign accents, traveling together, were seen boarding a ship in Boston just days before the raid. Another sighting came from New Orleans, then Cuba, then Argentina. None confirmed, yet all plausible. They had left behind their names, their convent, their patients, but not their work. Somewhere, out in the world, the Ashford Sisters were starting over, and this time they would be even harder to find. Even with the convent dismantled and the sisters vanished, the true legacy of the Ashford operation was only beginning to reveal itself. What they left behind wasn't just horror. It was influence. Over the next few years, physicians and psychologists across the eastern seaboard began publishing theories that echoed, too closely, the techniques uncovered in Millbridge. Ideas about controlling deviant behavior through neurological intervention. about reforming personality through induced trauma, about memory not as sacred, but as something malleable, adjustable, replaceable. Some of these men cited unnamed sources. Others claimed European correspondence. But the language, the methods, even the diagrams were unmistakable. They came from Maine, from the Ashford Sisters, and while no one dared say their names publicly, the underground community of experimental researchers knew exactly where the real discoveries had come from. The sisters had become ghosts in the medical world, mythic, untouchable, feared, revered. And yet, not everyone had forgotten the cost. Sarah Whitman hadn't. She was the only woman to ever escape the convent after experiencing its treatments firsthand, and lived to tell the story. In April 1819, just days before the raid, she had fled into the woods with nothing but blood on her hands and horror in her eyes. She had stumbled through freezing rivers, slept in hollowed-out trees, and survived on berries and sheer will. Her escape had triggered everything: the sheriff's raid, the federal investigation, the exposure of the sisters' secrets. Without her, the convent might still be operating in silence, behind those stone walls. But freedom had not brought her peace. After giving her statement to the authorities and helping identify some of the victims, Sarah had quietly disappeared from public life. The trauma had taken its toll. She suffered from night terrors, paranoia, long silences where she would drift into memories that felt more like someone else's than her own. Her family, ashamed of her testimony and the scandal it brought, pushed her into the background. She eventually moved west, alone, changed her name, tried to forget, but she couldn't. In 1860, decades later, an anonymous manuscript arrived at the office of a Boston historian known for documenting American medical developments. It was nearly 300 pages long, handwritten, bound in weathered leather. It contained a full account of the Convent of Eternal Tears. From the inside, the author described the intake process, the manipulation, the psychological preparation, and finally, the procedures. She didn't use scientific jargon. She used memory, pain, emotion. She described the moment she realized they were not treating her, they were testing her. How they measured her skull, how they recorded every reaction she had to food, to sound, to light. How they told her, gently, that they were going to help her forget her shame. But she had no shame, only strength, strength they couldn't erase. The manuscript was signed at the end with 3 words. I remember everything. The historian, horrified and captivated, preserved the document. But he never published it. Too dangerous, he said. Too disruptive. It sat in a locked drawer for nearly a century before a graduate student rediscovered it. By then, the names had faded from public memory. The convent was a local legend, a whisper of old evil. But the manuscript changed that. It reignited interest. Researchers, journalists, even theologians began re-examining the story, not just as a horror tale, but as a warning. What had happened in Maine wasn't the work of monsters. It was the work of brilliant minds without conscience, and it could happen again, anywhere. All it takes is a locked room, a willing subject, and a belief that the end justifies the means. And somewhere, out there, the sisters were still watching, still waiting, still perfecting what they started. As Sarah's manuscript quietly circulated through academic circles, it became clear that her story wasn't just a chilling testimony. It was evidence, proof that the Ashford sisters had not acted in isolation. In the decades following the convent's exposure, new patterns began to emerge. Facilities sprang up in remote corners of the country, institutions cloaked in religious terminology or hidden behind vague terms like reform schools and asylums for the troubled. And the deeper one looked, the more familiar the language became. Documents from a private sanatorium in Pennsylvania described correctional interventions to purge deviant impulses. A women's hospital in Chicago promoted neurological quieting as a path to proper domestic adjustment. The phrasing shifted, the terminology evolved, but the intent remained. Erase the resistance. Shape the mind. Preserve the shell. What the Ashford Sisters had begun in the woods of Maine had not died with their disappearance. It had multiplied. In 1872, a young physician named Dr. Everett Blaine visited a closed-door medical conference in Vienna. He returned to New York with strange ideas, wild theories about brain pathways and behavioral conformity. Within a year, he opened a private women's clinic in Albany. He claimed to specialize in hysteria, in women who were too restless, too curious, too opinionated. His procedures weren't just surgical. They were architectural. Patients described long hours in solitary rooms, rhythmic sound exposure, strobe lights, chemical sedatives, and always, at the center of it all, a singular goal: obedience. Records from Blaine's clinic showed clear evidence that his techniques mirrored the ones uncovered in Millbridge. But when asked how he developed such methods, Blaine always gave the same answer. Inherited wisdom, he'd say with a knowing smile, from pioneers whose names the world forgot. That phrase appeared again, nearly identical, in the writings of a British neurologist working in South Africa, and later in the personal letters of a Russian researcher exploring memory suppression during wartime. It was as if the sisters had become doctrine, a secret lineage of practitioners who didn't just remember their work, but worshipped it. In 1901, an investigative reporter named Henry Dalton stumbled across something he wasn't meant to see. While covering a routine zoning dispute outside Baltimore, he discovered that a long-abandoned monastery was being renovated, not by the church, but by a private medical foundation. What he found inside forced him to flee the country. Beneath the building, workers had uncovered sealed crates. Inside, preserved tissue samples, handwritten procedure logs, surgical instruments dated nearly a century earlier, and all marked with a single insignia, a triangle encasing 3 interlocking serpents. Dalton, fearing for his life, fled to Canada and published his findings anonymously. The insignia would reappear over the next 2 decades, in Paris, in Berlin, in São Paulo, each time associated with a facility specializing in cognitive restructuring or emotional regulation. Each time the pattern followed the same script: vulnerable women, hidden locations, irreversible change. By the time the 1930s arrived, whispers of the Ashford doctrine had woven themselves into the darkest corners of global medicine. Entire fields began to sprout from their twisted roots: behavioral psychiatry, surgical neurology, memory correction. Some of it bore fruit that saved lives, but much of it, too much, was born in silence, in pain, in shadows. Even today, modern procedures for trauma recovery or habit reversal carry traces of the original techniques. And while the science has evolved, the ethics often lag behind. The question remains: how many of those advancements came from genuine discovery? And how many were stolen from forgotten suffering? Because somewhere, hidden beneath the polished halls of today's research centers, the legacy of the sisters lives on, in unmarked boxes, in unexplained methods, in results too clean to question. The convent may have burned, but the fire never truly went out. By the mid-20th century, the Ashford influence had become something unspoken, an invisible blueprint woven into the dark fabric of institutional science. While hospitals and universities flourished under the banner of progress, a parallel current moved beneath them. Research labs buried in sub-levels, clinics without signage, names scrubbed from directories, but always the same principles: controlled isolation, targeted memory disruption, emotional suppression through structured trauma. And the further one dug, the more one thing became clear: Someone had preserved the original Ashford archives. Not just copies, originals, the detailed procedure logs, anatomical sketches, experimentation notes written in Agatha's hand. One researcher, Dr. Martin Keeler, admitted under oath during a Senate ethics hearing in 1957 that he had studied documents retrieved from a remote facility in Maine that offered unmatched insight into behavioral reprogramming. He claimed the material had arrived through anonymous intermediaries in sealed containers marked with European customs stamps. When pressed, Keeler refused to reveal more. But before the committee could investigate, he was found dead in his apartment. An apparent suicide. His notes, of course, were missing. From that moment on, the sisters' names vanished again from public records, but in secret, they remained a holy trinity of unregulated science. Their story became an initiation test among certain underground circles. Young researchers were given excerpts from their journals, stripped of names, and asked to evaluate the work. Most believed the material to be modern, if unorthodox. Only when told the true origin did they realize how far ahead of their time the sisters had been, and how far removed from morality. But not everyone who read their work recoiled in horror. Some became disciples. In 1974, a psychological facility in rural Oregon was shut down after allegations of patient abuse. When investigators entered the premises, they found locked files detailing neurological procedures that hadn't yet been approved by any known board. One room contained a series of still-functioning machines that recorded electrical brain patterns during emotional trauma. Each device had a serial number, and each was traced back to a French manufacturer known for producing equipment in the 1930s for overseas buyers. In a storage closet tucked behind unused wheelchairs and broken typewriters, officials discovered a leather-bound ledger. Inside, a single phrase written over and over in increasingly frantic handwriting. Submission is salvation. Submission is salvation. Submission is salvation. The phrase appeared dozens of times in the Ashford archives. Even across decades, the language never changed. And then came Argentina. In 1981, an aging surgeon named Emilio Santoro published a short clinical article in a Buenos Aires medical journal. It went largely unnoticed, dry, sterile language describing targeted behavioral recalibration via invasive neurosurgery. But a young journalist named Clara Estevez, researching unethical medical practices during the Dirty War, noticed the article's footnotes. One citation referenced a paper from 1815, allegedly penned by Dr. A. Brennan. The name rang no bells in local academia, but it chilled Clara to her bones. Digging further, she found records of a small medical facility once owned by 3 elderly British women who had arrived in Buenos Aires in 1850 under assumed names. They operated quietly for nearly 2 decades before disappearing in 1869, leaving behind no trace except a sealed basement that was never opened until Clara insisted. The basement revealed a collection of surgical instruments, medical sketches, and anatomical models. On the far wall, scrawled in faded ink, were 3 names: Agatha, Prudence, Temperance. Clara's discovery should have made headlines, but the story never aired. Her article was pulled from publication. The newspaper issued no statement, and Clara disappeared 2 weeks later. No one ever found her, but her notes survived, and in those pages, one question echoed louder than all the others. If the sisters survived one lifetime and buried themselves in another, what else have they carried forward? And who, exactly, is still listening to their voice in the dark? Clara Estevez's disappearance became yet another shadow in a story already defined by them. But her notes, smuggled out by a trusted friend before authorities could seize them, found their way into the hands of a quiet group of archivists, men and women devoted not to the preservation of history, but its exposure. They called themselves witnesses. Founded in the wake of World War II, their mission was to uncover forgotten atrocities buried beneath official silence. Clara's file was marked Priority Red. Her descriptions of the sealed Argentine basement matched too closely with reports that had circulated for decades. Rumors of a 3-woman team practicing unsanctioned brain modification techniques across continents. The witnesses began cross-referencing Clara's findings with global institutional records. They found odd gaps, missing files, deleted names, anomalies in patient data. Hospitals in Spain, Portugal, and Morocco had closed under mysterious circumstances, always after sudden financial windfalls and reports of foreign consultants advising their psychiatric units. Each time, staff remembered 3 women, elegant, reserved, unquestionably intelligent, always together, always moving on just before scandal could catch up. In 1992, a breakthrough came from an unlikely place, a retired librarian in Quebec named Lucille Martin, who claimed to have encountered a strange patient during her time cataloguing rare medical manuscripts. The woman, she said, arrived at the university archives under diplomatic protection. She spoke with an English accent, requested access to restricted 19th-century surgical texts, and signed the visitor log as Dr. T. Ashwood. Lucille described her as ageless, perhaps 70, perhaps much older, wearing gloves in midsummer and possessing an uncanny familiarity with materials even professors had never touched. When asked about her interest, the woman reportedly replied, "I'm revisiting old theories. Much of it has been poorly remembered." Lucille didn't think much of it, until she read Clara's recovered notes 2 decades later. The descriptions matched perfectly, and so did the initials. Temperance Ashford. It was impossible, of course, unless it wasn't, unless what Clara suggested was true, that the sisters had found a way not only to escape, but to extend their lives. The witnesses theorized, what few dared to say aloud, that the sisters had applied their knowledge not only to others, but to themselves. Pioneering crude but effective forms of age deceleration through a cocktail of chemical therapy, surgical enhancement, and experimental self-modification. Their disappearance wasn't just to avoid justice. It was to outlast it. Lucille's account was the last confirmed sighting, but the documents that followed painted a disturbing picture. Transcripts from an unnamed European intelligence agency revealed surveillance footage of a private summit in Berlin in 2003. Footage that has since vanished, but not before one analyst leaked a written report. It referenced 3 elderly women of interest in attendance, unlisted, unnamed, dressed in black. They reportedly spoke quietly with a major pharmaceutical CEO and a prominent behavioral neurologist. No words were recorded, no audio captured. But shortly after the meeting, that CEO announced a new initiative, targeted neurological adjustment for adolescent patients diagnosed with behavioral disorders. The initiative was quietly shuttered 2 years later after widespread public backlash. But the traces remain. Chemical patents with unusual neurological targets, training manuals referencing reduction of willful defiance, and buried deep in corporate paperwork, consulting fees paid to anonymous offshore accounts tied to British trusts created over a century earlier. Trusts bearing the names Brennan, Ashford, and Whitmore. The names had changed, but the hands guiding the work had not. Not all ghosts rattle chains or appear in mirrors. Some write checks. Some publish papers. Some walk into research labs wearing credentials 100 years old and ask the world to forget what it should have never ignored. The Ashford Sisters did not haunt the past. They engineered the future, and somewhere they're still perfecting it. For most, the Ashford Sisters were no more than rumor. Names mentioned in footnotes, dismissed by academics, forgotten by history. But for a select few, their influence remained terrifyingly present. In 2010, a young neurologist named Dr. Naomi Vicks was recruited by a private think tank, known simply as the Emergence Group. It promised research freedom, cutting-edge funding, and a chance to explore frontier cognition. Vicks had no idea what that meant, until she was flown to an off-the-grid campus nestled in the Colorado mountains. The facility looked like a modernist retreat. Glass walls, minimalist design, rooms flooded with natural light. But underground, the air changed. Brightness gave way to steel corridors and echoing labs. It was there, beneath the image of serenity, that the true work unfolded. The patients weren't patients at all. They were subjects. Youths aged 14 to 20, each labeled with clinical euphemisms: acute resistance profile, compulsive inquiry disorder, chronic assertiveness syndrome. In plain language, they were rebellious, non-compliant, too intelligent, too outspoken, too unwilling to conform. Dr. Vicks reviewed the protocols with growing discomfort. The procedures combined chemical sedation with deep pattern stimulation, electromagnetic pulses targeted to disrupt neural pathways associated with critical reasoning and emotional self-definition. It was invasive, non-surgical, and disturbingly effective. Within 3 weeks, subjects once labeled difficult began exhibiting placid, compliant behavior. Blank smiles, simplified vocabulary, elimination of long-term memory access during stress states. The success rate? 91%. The source materials referenced in the procedure logs shocked her even more. Dozens of citations traced back to anonymous manuscripts, unpublished, unregistered, yet dated over a century earlier. Titles like Temperate Mind Realignment and Obedience through Calibrated Isolation. No authors, no institutions. But Dr. Vicks recognized the terminology, the phrasing, the structure. She'd read it once before, in a case study her mentor had dismissed as folklore, a file simply labeled Ashford Methodologies. She confronted the director, a calm, soft-spoken man named Elliot Sharp. He didn't deny it. They were visionaries, he said, ahead of their time. Misunderstood. But what they began, we are finishing. He spoke of Agatha, Prudence, and Temperance as if they were saints. Not murderers, not torturers, not the architects of silence. When Vicks threatened to go public, Sharp showed her the contracts she'd signed, the non-disclosures, the surveillance footage of her reviewing the procedure logs. Then he gave her a choice: remain and lead Phase 2, or disappear. She left the next morning, fleeing to Canada under a new identity. Within 6 months, her medical license was revoked, her apartment broken into, her laptop stolen, and all traces of her affiliation with the Emergence Group erased. But she had kept one thing: a hard copy of an internal document, 29 pages, tightly typed, no watermark. The title, Sisters of Subjugation, Cognitive Recalibration Protocol, Generation 3. The document described a system far more advanced than anything the Ashfords had developed in Maine. Real-time behavioral response tracking, implantable emotional dampeners, virtual reality environments engineered to rewrite core memory structures. And at the center of the entire program, a theoretical construct known as the doctrine, a guiding philosophy of absolute mental conformity. It referenced terms like neural humility, emotive flattening, and post-choice conditioning. The doctrine wasn't a treatment, it was a belief system. It suggested a world where freedom was a liability, where deviation was a defect, where compliance wasn't encouraged, it was engineered. And while the language was modern, the spirit was unmistakable. It was the Ashfords, refined, evolved, institutionalized. Dr. Vicks vanished shortly after sharing the document with 2 investigative journalists. Both reporters died in a car crash 3 weeks later. The document was never published, but it survives. And every so often, it resurfaces. In forgotten corners of the internet. In whispers at psychiatric conferences, in the eyes of patients who don't remember how they got better, or who they used to be. The doctrine was never meant for the public. It was a blueprint whispered between shadows, a tool passed hand to hand by those who believed not in healing, but in control, and its reach had only grown. By 2020, its principles had embedded themselves quietly into sectors no one expected. Educational programs designed to optimize behavioral consistency. Tech companies developing apps that tracked mood shifts in real time under the guise of mental wellness. Marketing platforms using emotion recognition algorithms to predict decision-making. But at the core of these innovations, there were signals, terms, phrases, protocols that echoed something far older. One research startup in Northern California, funded by a coalition of investors known only as the Convex Syndicate, advertised a breakthrough. Personality flattening for individuals deemed disruptive to group cohesion. Their pilot group consisted of former juvenile offenders, relocated from correctional institutions to secluded tech campuses for a new kind of rehabilitation. The company name: Ashford Dynamics. On the surface, it seemed like coincidence, a clever play on words. Until a whistleblower, an engineer known only as Delta, leaked internal presentations and development logs. They weren't just referencing the Ashford methods. They were replicating them, down to the neurological targeting maps first drawn in the convent basement over a century ago. Delta's leak sparked only a ripple, quickly buried by legal threats and NDAs. But it was enough for a few researchers to begin looking deeper. What they uncovered was staggering. A global web of facilities, all privately funded, many operating in countries with limited oversight, each one subtly different in purpose, but unified in design, re-education, realignment, emotional reset. Some were framed as elite boarding academies, others as alternative therapy retreats, a few as experimental branches of multinational pharmaceutical firms. But no matter the mask, the mission was the same: reshape the self until the original became unrecognizable. And somewhere behind the curtain, the same silent trinity kept appearing, not in person, not by name, but symbolically. A triangle. 3 points, always present in the branding, in logos, in architecture, even in color palettes. Agatha, prudence, temperance. The world had forgotten their faces, but it had not forgotten their blueprint. And still, there were survivors, quiet voices, broken lives, people who remembered flashes, facilities with white walls and no windows, dreams they couldn't explain, whole weeks of their lives missing, emotions gone dull, relationships destroyed, compliance without cause. Some called it trauma, others called it progress. But those who had seen the doctrine at work, truly seen it, knew better. It was neither. It was the continuation of a century-old ideology rooted not in madness, but in meticulous intent, a belief that identity could be erased and replaced. In a small farmhouse in Vermont, a former cognitive therapist named Mark Bellinger lives completely off-grid. No phone, no electricity, no visitors. He was once a lead consultant for a multinational think tank involved in behavioral reform research. He walked away after discovering one of the foundation documents cited an anonymous contributor who had supposedly died in 1894. The techniques, he said, weren't just immoral. They were invasive in ways the human mind wasn't meant to survive. He wrote one final entry in his personal journal before disappearing into isolation. They were never chasing obedience, he wrote. They were chasing erasure, the perfect blank slate, the disposable soul, and they've almost found it. The world moved on, as it always does. Attention spans shortened. Technology advanced, but beneath the noise and progress, the signal remains. the signal that started in the pines of Maine, with 3 women, 3 minds, 3 obsessions, and a vision of silence so complete it could be mistaken for peace. The Ashford legacy didn't just survive, it adapted. In the age of information, secrecy had become both harder to maintain and easier to weaponize. The sisters' methodology, once hidden behind stone walls and locked basements, now wore the face of modern innovation. It lived in encrypted files, in biotech patents, in wellness startups with billion-dollar valuations, and it had never been more dangerous. In 2023, a cyber forensics team investigating data leaks from an international neuroscience conglomerate stumbled onto something they weren't meant to see. A folder buried 14 directories deep. No labels, just a symbol. 3 overlapping serpents forming a triangle. Inside were files spanning over 2 centuries. Digitized scans of handwritten notes, audio recordings in German, French, and an archaic form of English. Video footage that had no business existing, grainy black and white reels showing surgeries too precise for their supposed era. At the heart of it all was a central database marked DPRT Ash Core. It was the digital resurrection of the sisters' original work, a living archive. The code architecture was advanced, far beyond anything the forensics team had encountered. It was clear the files had been intentionally obfuscated, fragmented across global servers, with real-time redundancy protection. Whoever built it hadn't just wanted to preserve the research, they wanted to ensure it could never be destroyed. Among the encrypted transcripts, one stood out, titled Memory as an Artifact, the Redesign of Self. It outlined a comprehensive framework for isolating and reprogramming memory clusters in the human brain. It referenced not just theoretical models, but field data, real case studies, recent ones. The file listed the subjects by number, age, location, procedure length, outcome status, and every one of them was marked resolved. In simple terms, erased. None of it was officially acknowledged. No lawsuits, no charges, just silence. The few members of the forensics team who tried to go public were met with swift discrediting, jobs lost, reputations ruined, families harassed. But one member, a woman named Rhea Calder, had anticipated that outcome. She vanished before the team was dismantled, and 3 months later, she released the data to a closed, encrypted network of underground researchers, those who'd already spent their lives chasing fragments of the Ashford conspiracy. For the first time, they had something real, something verifiable. They called it the Last Testament, not because it ended the story, but because it confirmed it had never ended at all. Within weeks, researchers across the globe started to compare notes. Patterns emerged, unexplained disappearances linked to institutions that had been listed in the database. Psychiatric facilities with unusually high turnover and strangely identical recovery rates. Private schools reporting unprecedented student discipline with 0 formal behavioral programs. And again, always, the symbol, the triangle, the 3 serpents. One neurologist from Finland, who had been researching gene silencing therapies, decoded part of the database's index and found something chilling: genetic identifiers linked to historical DNA samples. It suggested that the Ashford legacy wasn't just theoretical anymore. It was hereditary. Someone, somewhere, was actively experimenting with passing down modified cognitive traits from generation to generation. It wasn't just about controlling thought. It was about embedding silence into bloodlines, making obedience inheritable. No treatment, no surgery, no instruction required. Just the right lineage, and at the center of it all, a name buried in the metadata. P. Ashford, MD, MSc, DPhil. A signature, modernized, authenticated by blockchain timestamp, and dated 2022. Someone was still using their name, not as myth, but as authority. And if that was true, then one question remained, unanswered, unspoken, and more terrifying than anything else. What if the sisters were never trying to disappear? What if they were only waiting for the world to catch up? The Ashford name had become something more than myth. It was now a watermark, subtle, invisible, but woven through the most advanced and ethically ambiguous corners of modern science. Not just remembered, not just feared, institutionalized. But what no one had accounted for was the pattern, a timeline stretching over 2 centuries, with each appearance bringing more sophistication. Each disappearance, more silence. It was almost as if the sisters had been rehearsing, perfecting, not merely the science of control, but the art of concealment. In 2024, a group of independent archivists calling themselves the Black Threshold released a report so detailed, so meticulously documented, that it briefly made global headlines before vanishing under pressure from unseen forces. The report outlined a secret network of facilities, all sharing encrypted infrastructure, biometric databases, and cognitive modification software. The most shocking claim: one of the facilities, buried beneath a tech-forward clinic in Seattle, had been operational since 1965. Its original name, the Whitmore Adjustment Institute. On the surface, it specialized in high-profile addiction recovery. But records revealed a darker truth. Patients often returned home transformed, compliant, vacant, emotionally neutral. Their families described it as miraculous. But investigators noted something else. They no longer asked questions. The report linked the clinic's founders to a series of defunct European companies with obscure ties to wartime experimentation. The founding charter even listed 3 silent partners. Only their initials appeared: A. B. T. Agatha, Brennan, Temperance. It made no sense. It defied logic, biology, time itself. Unless the impossible was true. Unless the sisters hadn't just preserved their methods, but themselves. The Black Threshold proposed a theory that pushed the edge of credibility, even for seasoned researchers. That the Ashford Sisters had achieved what they once only theorized: extended longevity through neurochemical recalibration and controlled cellular regeneration. That their self-experimentation hadn't been a footnote in their research. It had been the core. They weren't merely guiding the doctrine from the shadows. They were still living it. One lead archivist wrote, "The sisters never intended to conquer death, only identity. If the mind can be preserved, refined, rebooted, then the vessel is irrelevant. The soul becomes software. And if that were true, then perhaps they no longer existed as women. Perhaps they had become something else. Principles wrapped in flesh, doctrine wearing a smile." The report ended with a question, scribbled in the margin of its final page, a question no one had yet dared ask aloud. What if they're already in the room? Not as memories, not as echoes, but as leaders, mentors, visionaries at the helm of the very industries that claim to advance human thought. What if the most celebrated minds in neurobehavioral science are simply reflections of the sisters' final design? What if the world didn't defeat the Ashfords? What if it became them? Even now, in private institutions, in corporate labs, in high-security think tanks that never see sunlight, the doctrine continues to evolve. Polished, branded, marketed, all under the banner of self-improvement, digital harmony, and neurological wellness. And yet, beneath the gloss, one truth persists. It started in the woods of Maine, with 3 women, 3 minds, 3 obsessions. And now, long after their bodies should have turned to dust, their vision stands, untouched, unbroken, unburied. Not in graves, but in patents, in algorithms, in the quiet compliance of those who never knew they were being rewritten. They don't need to haunt the past, because they own the future. And somewhere, behind glass walls and security codes, a woman in black still watches from a darkened room. She doesn't speak. She doesn't move. But she listens. and she remembers everything.